Hi, welcome back to our learning channel. Once again, this is Johnrocks, your host for today. For this video, we are going to learn about the different terms such as allele, different forms of alleles like dominant and recessive, differentiate between homozygous and heterozygous, genotypes and the phenotypes. So what are the rules and functions and why are they part of this basic genetics? And we are going to investigate the probabilities of the possible offspring out of the given traits. What are the genotypes and the possible phenotypes? So guys, let's watch this. What are alleles? Alleles are one form of a gene. One form can be dominant and the other is recessive. These are genes that control the trait. Two alleles are found at each loci on a chromosome. Remember that alleles are an alternative form of a gene on a homologous pair of chromosomes at a particular location called gene locus. Therefore, for the above homologous chromosomes, as you can see on the illustration, the gene that controls the height of a plant is made up of two different alleles, one for the tall, which is capital T, and one for short, which is small t. Now, what are dominant and recessive alleles? There are different versions of a gene are called alleles. Alleles are described as either dominant or recessive depending on their associated traits. Since human cells carry two copies of each chromosome, they have two versions of each gene. These different versions of gene are called alleles. Alleles can be either dominant or recessive. Take note on that. Dominant alleles show their effect even if the individual only has one copy of the allele, also known as being heterozygous. For example, the allele for brown eyes is dominant, therefore you only need one copy of the brown eye allele to have brown eyes. Though, with two copies you will still have brown eyes. If both alleles are dominant, it is called codominance. The resulting characteristic is due to both alleles being expressed equally. An example of this is the blood group AB, which is the result of codominance of the A and B, which is dominant alleles, while the recessive alleles only show their effect if the individual has two copies of the allele, and that is also known as being homozygous. For example, the allele for blue eyes is recessive. Therefore, to have blue eyes, you need to have two copies of the blue eye allele. So, as what you have noticed, the illustration that show the inheritance of dominant and recessive alleles for eye color. Dominant, dominant. Recessive, recessive. Heterozygous, heterozygous. Homozygous, homozygous. Now, what is the difference between heterozygous and homozygous? From the word homo means same. Zygous means having genetic material. A homozygous individual carries two copies of the same allele, while hetero means different. Zygous means having genetic material. A heterozygous individual carries two different alleles. Since an organism usually inherits one of each chromosome from its mother and one from its father, it will have two versions of every chromosome. Each chromosome contains many genes. The different expression of a gene are called alleles. Genotype, genotype, phenotype, phenotype. How can you differentiate between genotype and the phenotype? When we talk about genotype, that refers to the alleles that an individual receives during fertilization for a particular trait, while the phenotype refers to the physical appearance or actual appearance of an individual resulting from the expression of a genotype. In genotype, present inside the body as genetic material, while in phenotype, expression of genes as the external appearance. In genotype, it can be determined by scientific methods such as polymerase chain reaction, while the phenotype, it can be determined by observing the organism. Here is our next activity, by investigating genetic probabilities of an unknown offspring. So our students prepare materials like pencil, paper, and a coin. During the activity, our students should follow the correct procedure by investigating genetic probabilities of an unknown offspring. In step 1, students will make a table and write the traits, genotype, and the phenotype. In step 2, our students flip the coin twice, 2 times, to determine the genotype for the horn trait. So this is just only for example. Remember, heads is for a dominant allele and tails is for a recessive allele. So those are the indicator once or right after tossing the coin. Right after our students done in step 2, we will proceed to step 3. Based on the table below, determine the genotype and the phenotype for the horn trait, based on the given example on the previous page. So here are the given traits like horns, tail, ears, teeth, leg shape, and a tongue. So in this example, suppose you get heads and a tail for the first 2 flips for the trait of horns. This means that you get a dominant allele and a recessive allele. You will write A, big letter A or capital A, and small letter A in the genotype column. So the phenotype is absent. So as you have noticed in the trait, next to that is dominant and a recessive allele. Now let's find out our observation and the following discussion. Based on the above observations serves as an example as there are other combinations on the coin flipping results. Alright? So let us remember that the indicator must be heads is always dominant, and if the result is tail, that should be recessive. So in this case, there are few possibilities of genotypes and phenotypes of a trait. In every offspring will inherent depending on the alleles that the offspring received. Observation number 2. Other offspring produced by other groups have different combination of genotypes and the phenotypes. As what you have noticed, Traits given, for example, horns. Next, tail, ears, teeth, leg shape, and tongue. And what will be the genotype? So, how are we going to determine the genotype? So, this is very simple. Genotype is always being written by letters or a pair of letters. Alright? So, say for example, horns represents with letter A. Tail represents with letter C. Ears represents with letter P. Teeth represents with letter S. Leg shape represents with W. Tongue represents with letter L. These are the following representation of letters by writing genotypes. And what about phenotypes? How are we going to write or determine the phenotypes? Say for example, in horns that represents absent. So it will depend if it's dominant or recessive. So it depends on the result by flipping a coin. Alright? Next, tail. The representation of phenotype is straight. For ears, we have pointed. For teeth, we have single row. For leg shape, we have narrow. And for the tongue, we have long. By writing phenotypes, always remember about the actual physical appearance, the way how you describe that organism according to its own traits. Based from our conclusion, therefore, the offspring produced have a rare probability of having the same combination of features. So in every offspring, there are many probabilities that will depend on male and female gamete.